In 711 AD, an army crossed from Africa into Spain. They were Muslim warriors from North Africa, part of a civilization that had exploded out of Arabia in less than a century. Sweeping across the Middle East, Persia, and North Africa with breathtaking speed. Within 7 years, they had conquered almost the entire Iberian Peninsula, what we now call Spain and Portugal. They built a civilization there that was, by any measure, the most advanced in the Western world. While the rest of Europe was scraping by in mud and darkness, the Muslim city of Cordoba had streetlights, public libraries, running water, hospitals, universities where Christian, Jewish, and Muslim scholars sat side by side and argued about mathematics and medicine. And then, 800 years later, they were gone. Expelled, exiled, erased. The story of medieval Europe is not the story of a continent sleeping through the Dark Ages, waiting to wake up for the Renaissance. It's the story of a continent on fire, with faith, with ambition, with violence, with genius. This is part 4, and nothing is what you think it was. After Rome fell, Western Europe fragmented.
Dozens of Germanic kingdoms rose and fell. The roads crumbled, the cities shrank. Latin, the common language of the empire, splintered into dozens of regional dialects that would eventually become French, Spanish, Italian, and Portuguese. For 3 centuries, there was no single unifying power in Europe. Then came Charles. Born in 742 AD into the Frankish ruling family, Charles was a warrior king in an age of warrior kings. He was physically imposing, reportedly over 6 feet tall in an era when the average man was 5'5". He fought constantly, 47 military campaigns in 43 years. But what made Charles extraordinary wasn't his fighting. It was what he did after the fighting. He built. Charles, who history would call Charlemagne, Charles the Great, understood that military conquest was worthless without administration, law, and education. He standardized currency across his empire. He issued agricultural regulations, the first common European farming standards. He established a court school that attracted scholars from across Europe. He reformed the writing system. The Carolingian minuscule that his scribes developed is the direct ancestor of the lowercase letters you are reading right now. And on Christmas Day, 800 AD, Pope Leo III placed a crown on his head in St. Peter's Basilica in Rome. Charlemagne became emperor of the Romans. The Holy Roman Empire had begun. For the first time since the fall of Rome, a single Christian emperor ruled most of Western Europe. His empire covered what is today France, Germany, the Netherlands, Belgium, Luxembourg, Switzerland, and northern Italy. Sound familiar? These are the founding nations of the modern European Union. The first European summit of heads of state took place in 800 AD. The currency Charlemagne introduced, the denarius, served as the common coin of Europe for centuries. The EU today gives an annual prize called the Charlemagne Prize to individuals who have contributed to European unity. The father of Europe died in 814 AD, but the idea he embodied that Europeans share something that makes unity both possible and desirable, never died. Here is a fact that gets left out of most Western history classes. Much of what we call the Renaissance, the great flowering of European art, science, and philosophy in the 14th through 16th centuries, would not have been possible without Islam. When the Western Roman Empire collapsed, enormous amounts of Greek and Roman knowledge were lost in the West. Libraries burned, scholars scattered, texts were forgotten. But in the Islamic world, those texts were preserved. Muslim scholars in Baghdad, Cairo, and Cordoba translated Aristotle, Plato, Euclid, and Galen into Arabic. They didn't just copy them, they studied, critiqued, and built on them. Muslim mathematicians invented algebra. The word is Arabic, al-jabr. Muslim astronomers mapped the stars. Most of the stars we know today have Arabic names: Aldebaran, Betelgeuse, Deneb. Muslim physicians wrote medical textbooks that were used in European universities until the 17th century. Muslim philosophers developed the scientific method, the practice of testing ideas through controlled observation, centuries before Francis Bacon. And the center of this intellectual world in the West was Al-Andalus, Muslim Spain. The city of Cordoba, by the year 1000 AD, had a population of 500,000 people, making it the largest city in Western Europe. It had 70 libraries, 900 public baths, and a university that attracted students from across Europe and the Middle East. In the Alhambra Palace in Granada, completed in the 14th century, you can still see the architecture of this civilization. Geometric patterns of breathtaking complexity, water flowing through channels in the floors, light filtered through latticed screens, poetry carved into the walls. It was one of the most refined civilizations Europe had ever seen. And from the universities of Al-Andalus, the lost knowledge of ancient Greece came back to Europe, translated from Arabic into Latin by Jewish and Christian scholars working alongside Muslim ones. Aristotle's works on logic, biology, and physics re-entered European thought through Spain. The numerals you use today, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, are Arabic numerals brought to Europe through Al-Andalus.
Before them, Europeans calculated with Roman numerals. Try doing long division with Roman numerals. It's nearly impossible. The Arabic number system, including 0, a concept that had not existed in European mathematics, made modern science and engineering possible. Europe owed the Islamic world a debt that it was often reluctant to acknowledge. In 1095 AD, Pope Urban II stood up before a council of bishops in France and gave a speech that changed the world. He called on Christian warriors to take up arms and march to Jerusalem, to recapture the holy city from Muslim rule. He promised forgiveness of sins to everyone who went. He promised glory. He promised heaven. The crowd's response was thunderous. God wills it. Within a year, hundreds of thousands of people, knights, peasants, priests, women, children, were on the march toward the Middle East. The First Crusade was, in many ways, a military success. Jerusalem was captured in 1099. A Crusader kingdom was established in the Holy Land. But the path there, and the events in the city when it fell, were horrifying. Before the Crusaders had even left Europe, They turned on the Jewish communities in the cities along the Rhine, in Mainz, Worms, Speyer. Thousands of Jews were massacred, people who had lived peacefully as neighbors for generations, murdered in the name of a holy war they had nothing to do with. When Jerusalem fell, the slaughter was indiscriminate. Muslim and Jewish residents, men, women, children, were killed in the streets.
The Crusades continued for 2 more centuries. 7 major crusades, dozens of smaller ones. They ultimately failed. Jerusalem was lost again. The Crusader kingdoms collapsed. But the consequences lasted far longer than the campaigns themselves. The relationship between Christian Europe and the Islamic world, poisoned by 2 centuries of warfare, would never fully recover. The memory of the Crusades is still alive today, invoked in political speeches, religious rhetoric, and geopolitical argument across the world. And the Jews of Europe, targeted in the first days of the First Crusade, entered a long era of persecution that would darken European history for the next 8 centuries. The Crusades reveal something essential about medieval Europe, that religious faith was not just a private matter. It was political power, social control, military fuel. And when that power was misdirected, the results were catastrophic. In 1347, 12 ships docked in the Sicilian port of Messina. Most of the sailors on board were dead. The ones still alive were covered in black, oozing boils. Port officials ordered the ships out of the harbor immediately. It was too late. What came off those ships, carried by fleas on rats, was Yersinia pestis, the bubonic plague, the Black Death. Within 5 years, it had swept across Europe, from Sicily to Scandinavia. Between 1/3 and 1/2 of Europe's entire population was dead. Somewhere between 25 and 50 million people. Entire villages were wiped out. Cities lost half their populations. Fields went unfarmed. Trade collapsed. Churches ran out of priests to perform last rites. The psychological trauma was beyond anything Europe had experienced. People genuinely believed the world was ending. And yet, out of the catastrophe came change. The peasants who survived the plague found something unexpected. They were suddenly valuable. With so many people dead, labor was scarce. Lords needed workers. Workers had leverage for the first time in centuries. Wages rose. Serfdom, the system that kept peasants bound to land they didn't own, began to collapse. The survivors questioned the church. Why had God allowed this? Why had prayer not stopped it? Why had the priests died just like everyone else? The authority of the medieval church, already strained, cracked further under the weight of the Black Death. New ideas began to circulate. New questions were asked. A new generation of thinkers began to look backwards to ancient Greece and Rome for models of human achievement that didn't depend on church authority. They called it a rebirth of classical learning, in Italian, Rinascita, the Renaissance. In 1440, a German goldsmith named Johannes Gutenberg invented the movable type printing press. It doesn't sound dramatic. It was the most disruptive technology in the history of human communication until the internet. Before Gutenberg, books were copied by hand. A single Bible might take a monk a year to produce. Books were rare, expensive, and found mainly in monasteries and universities. After Gutenberg, books could be produced in thousands of copies. Costs collapsed. Literacy spread. Ideas that had once taken decades to travel across Europe could now spread in months.
The first major bestseller of the printing press era was a list of complaints. In 1517, a German monk and theology professor named Martin Luther wrote 95 theses, 95 arguments against practices of the Catholic Church.
Especially the selling of indulgences, essentially buying forgiveness for sins. He nailed them to a church door in Wittenberg. Within weeks, copies were printed and circulating across Europe. Within months, Luther was the most famous man on the continent. The Reformation had begun. Luther's core argument was simple and devastating. Salvation comes through faith alone, not through the church, not through priests, not through payments. Every person could read the Bible themselves and form their own relationship with God. He translated the New Testament into German, the language of common people, so they could read it. The church declared him a heretic. The emperor placed him under imperial ban. Luther went into hiding and kept writing, and the printing press kept printing. Europe fractured along religious lines. Catholic South versus Protestant North. Wars erupted. Thousands died. But something irreversible had happened. The idea that authority, religious, political, intellectual, could be questioned, challenged, reformed, that the individual had the right to think for themselves. That idea was now in print, in millions of copies, in every language. It couldn't be unprinted. Europe, at the end of the 15th century, was a continent in turmoil. The old religious unity shattered, the old feudal order crumbling. Constantinople, the eastern capital of Christendom, fallen to the Ottomans. And yet, somehow, Europe was more alive, more energetic, more intellectually dynamic than it had been in 1,000 years. The printing press was spreading ideas at unprecedented speed. Renaissance artists and scientists were rediscovering ancient knowledge and pushing beyond it. New nation-states, Spain, France, England, Portugal, were consolidating power. And on the western edge of the continent, at that cape where the land ends and the ocean begins, sailors were looking out at the Atlantic and asking, "What's out there?" In 1492, a Genoese sailor named Christopher Columbus convinced the Spanish crown to fund a voyage west. He was looking for Asia. He found something no European had ever imagined. And in Part 5, we watch Europe do what it has always done: encounter something new, something different, something it doesn't understand, and change everything, for better and for worse. This is the part of the story where everything explodes. Subscribe to Drawn and Buried now, and make sure the bell is on.
Part 5 is the finale. Colonization, Revolution, 2 World Wars, the birth of the modern world, and the question that Europe is still trying to answer today. Don't miss it. In 711 AD, an army crossed from Africa into Spain. They were Muslim warriors from North Africa, part of a civilization that had exploded out of Arabia in less than a century. Sweeping across the Middle East, Persia, and North Africa with breathtaking speed. Within 7 years, they had conquered almost the entire Iberian Peninsula, what we now call Spain and Portugal. They built a civilization there that was, by any measure, the most advanced in the Western world. While the rest of Europe was scraping by in mud and darkness, the Muslim city of Cordoba had streetlights. And then, 800 years later, they were gone. Expelled, exiled, erased.
The story of medieval Europe is not the story of a continent sleeping through the Dark Ages, waiting to wake up for the Renaissance. It's the story of a continent on fire,